Ancient voices, living voices, the sage message. From the beginning of time, they have always known, from the spirits of the elders, the truth comes home together. Ancient knowing living voice, the sage message.
Hello. Welcome back to yet another episode of Sage Sundays with Ikuku Labenguni. Last week, we spoke about how colonization was on a mission to destabilize and compromise indigenous African knowledge systems. And I had mentioned how religion had been one vehicle that through which this was accomplished. And in reflecting about religion, I'd profiled the different parental figures you're likely to encounter when it comes to the religious mindset in our families. I touched on the first Christians. I'd spoken about the ones who had been responsible for the cultural erasure through education. And then I'd also spoken about a group who continued to uphold those colonial values on religion and whether consciously or unconsciously then chose to neglect their spiritualism. And I continued to think about it after the episode. In my reflections post the episode, I'd realized that I had said something and hadn't followed through on the thought. I had mentioned how, for the first Christians, they had to adopt Christianity as a means of survival. And in adopting Christianity as a means of survival, that there was a traumatic imprint that they then carried, because for them it had been, you will be religious or you will die. And I had thought about how traumatic imprints are passed down from generation to generation. And so if you are a descendant of a people that suffered through colonization, then you most likely carry a genetic imprint of the trauma of colonization. That means that even when you come to a sense of enlightenment, even when you come to a point of realization that something was taken from you, there is a part of your genetics that will actively resist you going the other way, because your genetic coding is such that everything in your bones will tell you that this is unsafe. And so I believe that this is another way in which the settlers accomplished their agenda, whether knowingly or unknowingly, that by genetically coding us to fear ourselves, to fear our spirituality, that it then meant generations to come would feel less and less secure about wanting to follow their true nature, if I could put it that way. And in thinking about this, I then also started to think about the language that idlozi speaks. Because, it's next to impossible for us to think about religion, to think about the changes brought about by colonization without us interrogating the idea of language as well, because they brought in religion for sure, they brought in education, but in bringing in religion and education, all of this was masked in the idea that we needed to speak their language and not ours. So there's that as well. So what language does idlozi speak, right? I think this is an important thought. Primarily because in past episodes, I've spoken about how we would need to pray in order to communicate with our ancestors, right? That we need to pray and acknowledge them in our conversations with God as well, right? And I have often encountered people that will then say, but I don't speak my mother tongue fluently. And my typical response is then just say what you need to say in the language you feel you are able to express yourself effectively in. And that is true still. I don't want anything that I bring up in today's conversation to seem as though that is not true. It's okay for you to pray in a language that you believe you are capable of articulating your deepest thoughts in, right? Having said that, I do believe that ensuring that there is a generation of Black children, of Nguni children, of African children that are incapable of articulating themselves in their mother tongue is actually a premeditated setback that we haven't spent enough time interrogating. And I'll tell you why I think about this. Because in my research work, in listening to several experts on Indigenous African spirituality, I would like to say that 90% of the best information is in an Indigenous language. And I would like to believe that if you are not fluent in any Indigenous language, that you're then cut off from the information, as it were. That you have no way of piecing together the details until you maybe encounter a podcast like mine where I try to use English as the medium. And this is why I use English as the medium, by the way, because I was aware of this gap specifically, right? And so this need for us to interrogate the adequacy of us continuing to exist in a space where we are limited in our communication to English. Because there was a generation of Black people, our parents, for instance, who believed that it was a true mark of sophistication to be so fluent in English to the point where you could not express yourself fluidly in your mother tongue. And then there was the shaping of the education system, right? You have these elite schools that place zero to no emphasis on the Indigenous identities of Black children. I was lucky because while there was no real emphasis of the Indigenous language at school, my parents at home didn't play those games. My parents at home didn't play those games. And my paternal grandparents actually didn't speak English at all. And so we needed to be fluent to communicate with one side of the family. So there was never a possibility that we were going to stick with English, because it was never a thought that I would be unable to communicate with my great grandmother because I'd gone to school and could speak English. You know what I mean? This was never even a thought that crossed my parents' minds. And not to fault today's parents, but I need everybody to ask themselves, why do I speak the languages that I speak, and to the extent which I am able to speak them, and what is the legacy that I would like to pass on to the next generation? And I had to kind of think about this a few years ago. I mean, my nephew and niece are 20 and 21 this year. And I think it was the year they turned 7 and 8. And they just started school. And they were having this discussion in the car where they were speaking about some of their classmates. And my nephew then says, "Oh no, but did you ask Tabani about this?" And it took me a second to realize that what he was actually saying was, "Did you ask Tabani about this?" And so I asked him about it. And I was like, "Why did you just say Tabani's name like that?" And he was like, "Because that's what we call him in school." And I'm like, "But you know what his name means. You know what his name should sound like. Why did you do that?" And so I had to kind of dial it back, but help them understand why it was important for them not to contribute to defacing indigenous names. So it's stuff like that that I think about. And then I also think about when the right time is to conscientize your children on history and racial dynamics. And I will use my nephew and niece as my examples again, because they have been in our lives the longest. And with both my nephew and niece, I remember watching the remake of Roots a few years ago with them, and they were still in primary school. I don't remember how old they were, but they were still in primary school. And I remember watching that series with them, and their mother was like, "Dude, you're watching this with them and you're instilling these ideas in them about racial dynamics, and they still need to go to school and get along with white people." And I was like, is that a bad thing though? Because they should know the facts, right? I don't expect them to pick up the mantle and turn into Martin Luther King or Steve Biko or Mbuyane Handa. No. But I do expect them to be conscious of the realities of our existence as different racial groups, as it were. And so it's always irked me when I think about what is lost in generations to come when we do not equip them with all the information that they need to make the decisions that they need to make. And the question for me then becomes, what role does language play? And what does it mean if you do not speak your indigenous language well enough for you to teach it to your children? And so I believe there is a politics of identity that is fueled by our genetic disposition to resist our spiritualism. And it's a bit sad when you think about it, really, because it means there is no real way we can begin to strip back or take back what we lost without confronting these things that we are not immediately aware of. It took me a while to want to force myself to use my indigenous language in full, like full complete sentences. It took me a really long time. It took me a long time to feel comfortable enough to pray in my indigenous language. It took me a long time to fully lean into the idea of using the language that I knew was best in describing conditions that I could see in people during consultations. Right? Because the ancients in me speak the indigenous language. These are people that were born deep in Zululand who know nothing other than what existed then. And I then need to do the labor of translating. And this creates a gap. Nobody wants to speak about it, but it does create there's something there. And then there's also the impact of language on our indigenous symbolism and artifacts. And now I'm talking specifically about dreams. Because I don't know about the rest of you, but then I speak to my ancestors in my sleep. I speak to people in my dreams. And I'm given my instructions in my dreams as well. And 99.9% of the dreams that I've had and the instructions and discussions that have been given have not been in English. So I worry about how, while you may articulate yourself in English, how in a case where you do not speak your indigenous language at all and have no level of understanding of it, that you may be trapped in this sphere where you need lifetime interpretation of your dreams. That you may find yourself in a position where you are unable to connect with your people because you do not speak the same language. Because you are detached from your traditional symbolisms, from your traditional artifacts, that you would not recognize things for what they are in your dreams and therefore lose the deeper meaning and understanding behind some of your dreams. So I often wonder how we move forward from this, right? Like, how do you start to fix this? How do you turn the tide in this respect? And I genuinely believe we will all need to accept at some point that there is nothing to be celebrated in a lack of fluency in your mother tongue. And it's not that I want to shame anyone, it's to say that you probably were only a victim of this circumstance until the year you turned, and I'm being generous here, 18. From the point you were a fully grown adult, you had the choice to spend time learning your home language. I have met African people that speak 3 European languages, yet struggle with their mother tongue. And that is the definition of cultural erasure. Because what do you then pass down to generations to come if you cannot pass down the gift of language? So, yeah, I think about that. But again, I feel like I've been talking for a little while, and this was never meant to go on for as long as it has. But think about it. Think about why we would rather be fluent in English than fluent in our mother tongue. Why we would rather read English literature than read literature in our mother tongues. Think about why your children's first words are shaped by Miss Rachel and not someone else, right? Think about it. I will stop here. You are all loved. We will speak next week. Take care of yourselves.
Ancient voices, living voices, the sage message.